The morning Emma Crawford walked into the First Territorial Bank of Harlow Creek. The dust on her boots told the whole story of who she was before she ever opened her mouth. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Harlow Creek, nestled in the sun-hammered flatlands of West Texas, had not yet seen a woman quite like her walk through its doors alone. Women came to the bank with their husbands at their sides, or with fathers clearing their throats ahead of them, or with brothers standing just half a step in front, as though the doorway itself required a male escort to pass through properly. But Emma Crawford came alone, and she came with her chin lifted, and her hands wrapped around a leather satchel that had seen better decades, and her eyes, her proud, dark eyes, swept the room with a calm that was not born from ease but from something far more hard-won than ease. She was 32 years old, and every year of it showed honestly on her face in the way that good weather and hard weather show equally on good land. She was not a soft woman. She could not afford softness. Her hands, where they gripped the satchel, were rough with calluses that had been built up layer by layer over the 4 years since her husband, James Crawford, had died of a fever that swept through the county in the wet winter of 1878, leaving her with 40 acres, a herd of 50 cattle, a 9-year-old son named Thomas, a falling-down barn, and a mortgage that did not care one bit about grief or widowhood. She had held on to all of it with those hands. Every fence post, every water trough, every calf pulled in the dark hours of a cold morning. She had done it with help from no one except old Pete Dawson, who worked for her for what little she could pay him, and Thomas, who had grown into a boy capable of far more work than any boy his age should have needed to do. She had not sold a single acre. She had not asked for charity. She had shown up every year to this bank with her payment, and every year the man behind the desk had looked at her with that particular expression that men reserved for women who were doing things men believed only men could do, a mixture of mild surprise and barely concealed disbelief. Today was different, and she knew it was different before she had even ridden the 12 miles into town. She had received a letter 2 weeks prior from the bank, signed by a Mr. Horace Bellamy, informing her that due to a change in the bank's lending policies, her existing mortgage terms were being reviewed, and that she was required to appear in person to discuss the continuation of her loan. The letter used the kind of language that was designed to sound formal and reasonable, while making the skin on the back of your neck crawl. She had read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her satchel, and told Thomas that she needed to ride into Harlow Creek and that he was to stay on the property with Pete and not do anything foolish while she was gone. The bank was not a large building. It sat on the main street between the dry goods store and the land registry office, with a false front that made it look taller than it was, the way false fronts always made things look taller than they were. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of ink and wood polish, and the particular dry mustiness of paper money and old ledgers. There were 3 chairs along one wall for waiting customers, and a low wooden counter with iron grillwork, and behind the counter 2 young clerks who looked up when Emma entered. There were 2 other people in the bank. One was a rancher named Gus Mercer, who stood at the counter doing something involving a great many small coins, and who glanced at Emma with no particular interest. The other was a man seated in one of the 3 chairs along the wall, a large man in a dark coat with a hat resting on his knee, reading what appeared to be a contract or a deed of some kind, his reading glasses perched at the end of a straight, weathered nose. His name was Samuel Thatcher, though Emma did not know that yet. Samuel Thatcher was 38 years old, and he had the look of a man who had spent the majority of those years doing physical work without apology. He was broad through the shoulders and carried himself even seated with a kind of settled, unforced stillness that was different from the stiffness of men who were trying to look important. His hair was dark with a thread of gray at the temples, and his hands, resting on his knees on either side of the document he was reading, were the hands of a man who worked cattle and land the same way Emma did, not for the romance of it, but because that was the life he had chosen, and he had chosen it fully. He had come into the bank that morning to finalize the paperwork on a new grazing lease for the northern portion of his ranch, which bordered a creek that ran with good water even in the dry months. It was routine business, the kind he could have sent his foreman in to handle, but Samuel preferred to do his own paperwork in person. He did not trust the details of things to anyone else. Details were what saved you in the long run. He had been only half paying attention to the door when it opened, but something in the way Emma Crawford entered the room made him look up fully. It was not her appearance, though she was a handsome woman in a way that the land itself was handsome honestly, without decoration. It was the quality of her entrance. She did not hesitate. She did not look around to see who was watching her, the way people who felt uncertain of their welcome always did. She walked in as though she had as much right to be there as the floorboards, which she absolutely did, and yet there was something in the particular angle of her chin that told Samuel she knew very well that not everyone in that room would agree. He watched her cross to the counter and ask, in a clear, measured voice, for Mr. Bellamy. The clerk, a young man named Hooper, said that Mr. Bellamy was in his office and that he would let him know Mrs. Crawford had arrived. The way Hooper said Mrs. Crawford had a small, almost imperceptible apology in it, as though he already knew something about what was waiting for her in that office and was sorry for his part in the machinery of it. Emma nodded and stepped back from the counter and stood, not sitting, but standing, near the wall to wait. Samuel had set his document down on his knee and was no longer pretending to read it. He watched Horace Bellamy emerge from the back office a few minutes later, a man of middle age running toward heaviness, with a silver watch chain and the look of someone who had recently had a gratifying thought about something that was not good for anyone else. Bellamy greeted Emma with a smile that did not reach past his teeth. "Mrs. Crawford, good of you to come in. Please step this way." Samuel watched Emma follow Bellamy toward the office, and then he did something that surprised him. He stood up. He was not entirely sure why he stood. He had not intended to stand. It was not a deliberate decision in the way decisions were usually made, with reasoning and intention lined up ahead of the action. He simply found himself on his feet, with his hat in his hand, and with the clear and certain feeling that something about this situation required him to be standing rather than sitting. He could not have explained it better than that at the time, and he would think about it later and still not be able to explain it better. Emma had nearly reached the office door when she noticed him standing. She turned her head and looked at him directly, those dark, proud eyes landing on him with a frankness that was almost physical, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Samuel said, "Ma'am," and meant it as a simple acknowledgement of respect, the way you tipped your hat to someone you recognized as being worth respecting. Emma held his gaze for one beat too, and then she gave him the smallest nod, and it was the kind of nod that contained a great deal more than its size suggested, and she followed Bellamy into the office. Samuel sat back down, but he did not pick up his document again. The door to Bellamy's office did not close all the way. It was a heavy door that stuck a little in the frame, and it came to rest a quarter-inch from the latch, which was enough for the conversation inside to filter out into the bank's main room in the particular way that sounds carry in buildings with wooden floors and high ceilings. Samuel was not trying to listen, but he listened. Bellamy's voice first. "Mrs. Crawford, as I outlined in my letter, the bank is reviewing the terms of outstanding mortgages under new guidelines from our parent institution in Dallas. Specifically, we are looking at mortgages held by individuals who may not meet updated collateral requirements." Emma's voice level and careful. "My property is the collateral, the 40 acres and the herd, same as when I took the loan." Bellamy: "Yes, but the valuation standards have changed. And frankly, Mrs. Crawford, the bank has some concern about the long-term viability of an operation run without a male head of household to provide consistent." Emma's voice, still level but with a new edge that was like the edge of a blade that has been held flat and is now being turned. Mr. Bellamy. I have made every payment on time, every single one. You can look at your ledger and you will not find a single late payment with my name on it. Bellamy, clearing his throat. That is true. However, the new policy, Emma, I would like to see the new policy. In writing, I would like to see where it says that a woman who has met every obligation of her loan can have her terms changed because she does not have a husband. A pause. The kind of pause that meant someone had not expected to be asked for documentation. Samuel set his document on the chair beside him and stood up again, and this time he walked to the door and knocked on the frame. Bellamy looked up with visible irritation. Emma turned, and her expression, he would remember it later specifically, was not one of relief or gratitude. It was one of wary assessment, the look of a woman who had learned that unexpected interventions often came with their own prices. Samuel addressed Bellamy directly. Horace, I happened to hear part of your conversation, and I want to ask you something directly. Is it your bank's actual policy, written policy, to review loan terms for borrowers who have made every payment, specifically because they're women without husbands? Because I would be very interested to know that. As a depositor at this bank, Bellamy's face went through several colors in quick succession. Mr. Thatcher, this is a private matter. Not entirely, Samuel said. Mrs. Crawford's business with this bank is her own business, and I won't pretend otherwise. But if the bank is changing terms on mortgages in good standing without written grounds to do so, that affects the confidence of every person who does business here, including me. There was a silence that lasted long enough to have its own weight. Emma was watching Samuel with those dark eyes, and he could feel the assessment in them. She was deciding what he was, what this was, whether there was something she needed to defend herself against in his intervention as well. He understood that instinct. He respected it. Bellamy said finally, with the smile of a man who is retreating but wants to appear to be choosing to retreat. Of course, there is always room to discuss. Mrs. Crawford, I believe your current terms can be maintained. I may have spoken prematurely. Emma said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I would like that in writing before I leave. She left Bellamy's office 20 minutes later with a document in her satchel that confirmed her existing loan terms would remain unchanged. Her expression had not changed significantly from the moment she had walked in, still that proud, controlled composure, but her grip on the satchel was a fraction looser, and Samuel, who had returned to his chair but had not stopped paying a low level of attention to the office door, noticed that. She came to stand near him, not because she needed to, but because he was between her and the exit, and stopping felt perhaps like the right thing to do. I did not need rescuing, she said. It was not hostile, it was simply accurate, and she wanted him to know that. No, Samuel agreed. You had him on the ropes before I walked in. I just made him aware there was a witness. Something shifted in her face, a very small thing, almost invisible, but he caught it. She said, Samuel Thatcher. He looked at her surprised. I know who you are, she said. You run the Thatcher spread out on the east side of the county. My husband knew your brother years ago. He stood up fully. Yes, and you're Emma Crawford. I know your land, good 40 acres near the Callaway draw. You know your county. I try to. There was a moment between them that had a different quality from the conversation up to that point, a warmth that neither of them was ready to identify yet, and both of them were too practical to reach for before it had a name. Emma said, Thank you. For what you did. I don't know if it was strictly necessary, but she paused and then finished honestly. It may have moved things along faster. That's all I hoped for, Samuel said. She nodded, and this nod was also larger than its size, and she went out through the bank door, and Samuel stood in the middle of the bank watching the door for a moment after it closed, and then sat back down, and this time he actually read his document. But he thought about the way she had walked in. He thought about it for the rest of the day. The weeks that followed had the quality of early spring in West Texas, days that were warm and bright and full of wind, with the particular freshness of a world that was choosing to be alive again after a hard winter. Emma's days were full in the way they were always full. She had fence line to repair on the south pasture, where a section had come down in the last big storm, and the cattle were prone to drifting toward it. She had a new calf that had come into the world weak-legged and needed watching. She had Thomas to keep up with his reading and his numbers. She was adamant about his education in a way that some of her neighbors found excessive for a ranch boy, but Emma believed in it the way she believed in good water and solid ground. She had the accounts to keep, the careful arithmetic of survival that she balanced every evening by lamplight at the kitchen table. She did not think about Samuel Thatcher very much, or at least she told herself she did not think about him very much, and if the memory of him standing up from that chair kept drifting across the surface of her thoughts the way a leaf drifts across the surface of still water, she attributed it to the general impressiveness of anyone willing to say a direct thing to Horace Bellamy's face. It was old Pete Dawson who first mentioned Thatcher's name again, about 3 weeks after the bank visit. Pete was a slow-moving, deeply weathered man of 60-something who spoke rarely, and when he did spoke mostly about cattle and weather, which covered most of the important subjects. He was fixing a section of the barn roof one afternoon when he said, without preamble, "Thatcher's spread is running their cattle to the east water this year. Heard his North Creek is drying up early." Emma looked up from where she was helping Thomas stack the feed grain. "Is that so?" "Might mean his herd drifts toward the Callaway draw boundary come summer," Pete said, with the detached observation of a man reporting weather. Emma thought about this. The Callaway draw ran along the northern edge of her property, and it was one of the reasons her land held its value. The draw kept water longer than the surrounding landscape. If Thatcher's cattle were moving in that direction, she would need to make sure her fence line along the northern boundary was solid, which it currently was not, because fixing the south fence had taken all of her fencing wire and most of her fencing time. She put Thomas in charge of measuring out the remaining grain and rode out to check the northern fence herself. The northern fence was in worse shape than she had remembered. There were 2 posts down and a stretch of maybe 30 feet where the wire had gone slack and low enough for a determined cow to step over. She was crouching down to assess the second post, testing the soil around its base, when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see Samuel Thatcher riding toward her from the east along the draw line, and she was not, in that first moment, entirely sure how she felt about that. He pulled up on the other side of the fence line and touched the brim of his hat. He was riding a good dark bay horse and wearing the practical, worn clothes of a man who had been out working his land since early morning. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, "I heard you were out checking your north line. Figured I should come introduce myself properly, since I think my herd is going to be spending some time near your boundary this summer." "Pete told me your North Creek is running low," Emma said. "It is," Samuel confirmed. "I wanted to come in person and give you fair warning and to ask what arrangement would work for you. I'm not looking to cause you any trouble with drifting cattle." Emma stood up and looked at him with those direct eyes. "The arrangement I would need is for this fence to be solid before your herd gets anywhere near it." He looked at the fence. He looked back at her. "That is a fair thing to need. I have fencing wire and 2 good hands who aren't doing much this week. If you'd be willing to let us come in and help shore up this line, that would serve both of us." She studied him for a moment. She was not a woman who accepted offers without thinking them through. "What would you want in exchange?" "Access to the draw water for a portion of my herd if the summer gets bad. I'm not asking for rights or anything formal, just the understanding that if my cattle need water and yours are taken care of, they can drink from the same draw." It was a reasonable ask. More than reasonable. It was the kind of ask that showed he had thought about what would be fair from her side as well as his. She had met enough people, in business and otherwise, who did not do that. "That is agreeable," she said. "When can your men come?" "Thursday, if that works for you." "Thursday works." He touched his hat again and turned his horse to go, and then he paused and turned back, and there was a slight change in his expression, a careful, almost uncertain quality that was new and that she found, involuntarily, interesting, because he did not look like a man who was uncertain very often. "I don't know if this is the right thing to say," he said. but I was glad to be in that bank the day you came in. I've known Horace Bellamy for a long time, and I know the way he thinks, and I was glad to be able to say something that was worth saying." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the right thing to say." He nodded, and this time he rode off, and she watched him go and then looked back at the fence, and spent the rest of the afternoon measuring the damage and calculating what needed to be done. But her mind was running a second, quieter track underneath the practicalities, and that track had to do with the particular way some people occupied the world solid and present and clear, and how rare that quality actually was when you looked for it. Thursday came with a good sky and a dry wind, which was ideal for fence work. Samuel arrived with 2 hands, a younger man named Clay who moved quickly and efficiently, and an older hand called Marsh who was quiet and thorough. They brought the wire and the tools and the extra posts, and they worked along Emma's northern boundary with the kind of focused, uncomplaining industry that told her these were men who had been working together a long time and did not need to be directed at every step. Emma worked alongside them. She did not stand back and supervise. She set posts and stretched wire and handed tools with the same ease and competence that she brought to everything on her land, and she saw Samuel register this, not with surprise exactly, but with a kind of recognition, like something confirmed. Thomas came out at midday with a bucket of water and a cloth bundle of corn bread that Emma had made that morning, and he distributed these with the seriousness of a child who understood the importance of hospitality on a working day. He was a lean, dark-haired boy with his mother's eyes and his father's tendency to observe before he spoke. He looked at Samuel with careful interest and said, "You're the man who runs the Thatcher spread." "I am," Samuel said, accepting a piece of corn bread. "Mr. Fowler at the dry goods says you have the best cattle in 3 counties, Thomas said. Samuel glanced at Emma with a hint of amusement. "Mr. Fowler is generous. Do you have horses too?" "I do, including a colt about a year old that still doesn't have a name." Thomas's eyes lit up with an interest that he immediately tried to conceal because he was 9 and thought that showing too much excitement about things was undignified. "What color?" "Sorrel with a blaze." "That's a good color," Thomas said, as though rendering a professional assessment, and Samuel kept his expression serious and agreed that it was indeed a very good color. Emma, who had been watching this exchange while drinking from the water bucket, felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, something warm and slightly alarmed. The way you feel when you have been cold for a long time and warmth comes back, and the feeling of it is almost too much. She turned back to the fence post she was working on. The fence was finished by late afternoon, solid and tight along the full northern boundary. Emma paid Clay and Marsh for their day's work in cash, which she had set aside specifically for this purpose, and both men nodded their thanks and loaded their tools onto their horses. Samuel lingered a moment, walking the finished fence line one last time and giving the posts the particular testing shake that told you if a post was truly set. "Good work," he said, though it was not entirely clear whether he was addressing himself, her, or the fence. "Good work," Emma agreed. "Then, have you eaten?" "There's more corn bread, and I have a pot of beans on." She said it simply, without elaboration, the way you offered food to someone who had put in a day's honest work on your property, which was exactly what he had done, and she was not going to read anything more into it than that. And yet when he said yes, she felt that warm, alarmed thing again. They ate at the outdoor table beside the kitchen door, which was where Emma and Thomas ate on good weather evenings. Thomas talked with more animation than he usually showed around strangers, asking about the cattle operation and the horses, and whether Samuel had ever seen a mountain lion in the western draws, which Samuel had once, and he described it with enough detail that Thomas sat forward on the bench and forgot to eat his beans. Emma listened to this and ate and said little, but she was paying close attention to everything, to the way Samuel talked to her son, which was with genuine attention, and without the excessive patience or the barely concealed impatience that adults often showed children, but instead with the simple respect of one person talking to another person who happened to be smaller. She noticed that he did not talk down to Thomas and did not talk over him and did not try to charm him the way adults tried to charm children when they were actually trying to impress the child's parent. She also noticed that he was watching her watching him at one point, and that when their eyes met across the table, he did not look away quickly, and neither did she. After Thomas had been sent inside to do his reading by lamplight, Emma and Samuel sat for a while longer at the table, and the evening settled around them with the particular quietness of the Texas flatlands in spring, which is a very large quietness that makes you feel simultaneously small and exactly the right size. He asked her about the ranch, the real questions, the practical ones, about water sources and grass conditions and how her herd had come through the winter. She answered directly and thoroughly because those were questions worth answering directly and thoroughly. He told her about his own operation, which was larger than hers but had its own difficulties, including a persistent problem with the east fence where the rocky ground made post-setting a misery, and a foreman who was excellent at the cattle end of things but could not keep a balance sheet to save his life. "I keep the books myself," Emma said. "So do I," Samuel said. "My father thought it was beneath a rancher to do his own accounting. He nearly lost the spread twice because of it." "My husband thought the same," Emma said. It was the first time she had mentioned James directly, and she said it without drama as a simple fact of her history. Samuel said, "I was sorry to hear he passed. I didn't know him well, but the men who did said he was a solid man." "He was," Emma said. "He was a good man and a good father." "He was not," she paused, choosing her words with the care she gave to everything. "He was not always an easy man, but he was honest and he worked hard and he loved Thomas very much. That counts for a great deal." "It counts for most of what matters," Samuel agreed. They sat quietly for a moment, and it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that required no filling. Emma said, "Were you ever married?" "I was engaged," Samuel said, "years ago. She was from a family in San Antonio. It didn't come to a wedding. Her family wanted someone with more established prospects, and at the time I was just starting the ranch and the prospects were not yet established." "That sounds like it hurt." "For a while," he said honestly, "and then it didn't, which told me something." Emma nodded slowly. She understood what that told him. She understood it more clearly than she might have expected to. He left when the dark had fully settled and the stars were thick and low, the way they got in the clear, dry air of West Texas. He thanked her for the meal, and she thanked him for the fence work, and they were both being completely sincere about these expressions of gratitude. And they were also both aware that the evening had been something more than an exchange of practical courtesies, and neither of them was quite ready to say that plainly yet. As he rode away into the dark, Emma sat for another few minutes at the outdoor table with her hands around a cooling coffee cup, listening to the last of his hoofbeats fade into the wide, night-breathing silence of the land, and she let herself feel the warmth and the alarm together without pushing either of them away. She had been alone for 4 years. She had made her peace with alone. Alone, for her, was not emptiness. It was a kind of fullness that she had earned and that had its own dignity. But alone was not what she would choose if she were free to choose without fear, and she was intelligent enough to know the difference between what you accept and what you want. She went inside and checked on Thomas, who had fallen asleep with his book open on his chest, and she moved the book and pulled the blanket up and stood for a moment watching him sleep with the ferocious, protective love that was the central gravity of her life, and then she went to bed and slept without dreams. June came, and with it the summer heat that settled onto the land like a physical presence, something you negotiated with rather than escaped. The draw held its water well into the summer, and Thatcher's cattle drifted near the northern boundary as expected. The fence held, and there were no problems. Samuel came by twice in June with honest business reasons. Once to discuss the draw water access as the heat intensified, and once to return a section of wire that his hands had accidentally taken when they packed up their tools after the fence work. Both visits had the clean, clear structure of neighborly business, and both visits also lasted longer than strictly necessary. And both visits involved coffee at the outdoor table and conversation that ranged from practical ranch matters to things that were not practical ranch matters at all, things like what Emma had read recently, and what Samuel thought about the new county commissioner's road policies, and whether Texas would ever get the kind of dependable rail service that would change the economics of cattle ranching entirely. Emma was not naive about what was happening. She was 32 years old and had been a grown woman in the world for long enough to recognize the shape of something building. She was also aware of the particular complications of her situation. She had a child, a mortgage, a ranch that required everything she had, and a careful, hard-won self-sufficiency that she was not inclined to surrender lightly or quickly to anyone, no matter how interesting she found them. But she allowed the visits. She did more than allow them. She found herself, on the mornings when she thought he might come by, making sure the coffee was fresh, and she was honest with herself about why. It was Thomas who said something first, because Thomas was 9 and had not yet learned to be indirect about the obvious. He was helping Emma mend a bridle one evening when he said, without looking up from the leather, "Mr. Thatcher comes around a lot." "He does," Emma said. "On account of the fence and the water," Thomas said, testing the weight of this explanation. "That's right. And because he likes to talk to you," Thomas added, which was not a question. Emma looked at her son. He was focused on the bridle with an expression of careful neutrality that was trying not to be a smile. "What do you think of that?" Emma asked, because he deserved to be asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think he's a good man. He answered all my questions about the mountain lion without making me feel stupid for asking." Emma felt her throat tighten in the way it did when Thomas said something that made her love him so hard she had to look away. "That is a good quality," she said carefully. "He would probably give a horse a good name," Thomas added. Emma laughed, and it was the full laugh, the real one that she did not use very often, and Thomas grinned at his bridle. It was in July, during a spell of dry heat that was punishing even by West Texas standards, that the thing happened which changed the pace and direction of everything. Emma had ridden out at dawn to check on a section of the south pasture where she'd heard coyotes the previous night. She found 2 calves that had been harried but were uninjured, and a third that had a bad gash on its flank that needed cleaning and dressing. She was working on the third calf, alone out in the flat, dust-bright morning, when her horse, a reliable, steady gray mare named Nora, was spooked by a rattlesnake that had been lying hidden in the dry grass and reacted by pulling back hard on her reins. Emma, who had Nora's reins tied loosely to her wrist while she worked on the calf, was pulled sideways and came off her feet, and came down wrong on her left ankle on the rocky ground, and knew immediately, with the clarity of someone who had dealt with injuries before and knew what a serious one felt like, that she had sprained it badly or possibly done worse. She did not panic. Panicking was a luxury she could not afford and had long since stopped being tempted by. She sat on the ground and assessed. The ankle was swelling fast and the pain was significant, but she could move the joint, which probably meant not broken. The calf needed finishing. She was 2 miles from the house. Nora had shied back but not run off and stood 20 feet away, blowing nervously. Emma cleaned and dressed the calf's wound while seated on the ground, because the calf needed it and she was there, and the job was going to get done. Then she got herself onto Nora by finding a section of higher ground she could use as a mounting block, which took her 3 tries and a great deal of bad language, and she rode back to the house at a careful, patient walk that was its own kind of stubborn. She was sitting on the porch with her boot off and her ankle wrapped in a wet cloth when Samuel rode up the track, and she saw the exact moment he registered the situation, the set of her jaw, the elevated foot, the unconquerable straightness of her spine, and she saw the look on his face which was concern with no theatrics in it. He dismounted without rushing and came to the porch steps and looked at the ankle. "How bad?" he said. "Sprained. Maybe more, I'm not certain. There's a doctor in Harlow Creek now. Doc Reeves, good man." "I know who Doc Reeves is," Emma said, with the slight edge of someone who does not enjoy being told what they already know, and Samuel had the good sense to accept this and move on. "Can you ride 12 miles like that?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which was more than she would have done for most people. Most people she would have said yes to automatically. "Not comfortably," she admitted. "I have the wagon at home. I can go get it and be back inside an hour. We could put Thomas on his pony to follow." She looked at him. He had already worked out the logistics, had already thought about Thomas, had not offered to fix things in a way that required her to be helpless. "That would be useful," she said, with the same careful precision she used for anything she actually meant. He went and came back in under an hour, which meant he had moved his horses faster than was comfortable for them, a fact she noted. She got herself into the wagon with Thomas's help and Samuel's steadying hand at her elbow, which she accepted with neither exaggerated gratitude nor exaggerated resistance, and they drove to Harlow Creek with Thomas riding his pony, alongside with an expression of immense seriousness. Doc Reeves confirmed a severe sprain, not a break, and wrapped the ankle and told her to stay off it as much as possible for 2 weeks, which produced from Emma an expression that Doc Reeves, who was a practical man, understood to mean she would stay off it for whatever portion of 2 weeks she could manage without the ranch falling down. On the ride back, with the sun going down red and large behind the flat horizon, Emma sat beside Samuel on the wagon seat, and the jolting of the road was painful enough that she found herself holding the seat edge with both hands, and Samuel, without comment, drove more slowly and found the smoothest lines in the road with the kind of focused, quiet consideration that she was beginning to understand, simply how he operated. Thomas had ridden ahead and was a small figure in the orange light of the road ahead of them. Emma said, "Why were you coming by today?" "Wanted to tell you my herd was moving further east. You won't need to worry about the north boundary for the rest of the summer." He paused, and I wanted to see how things were. The simplicity of this, the plain acknowledgement without dressing it up, made something settle in her, like a door closing quietly against a draft. "I think you should know," Emma said slowly, as though she was working out the words as she went, which she was, "that I am not easy. I don't mean difficult exactly. I mean I have built something here. Thomas and I, it is not large or fine, but it is ours and it is solid, and I have worked very hard for it, and I am not going to do anything that puts it at risk." Samuel drove for a moment before responding. "I understand that," he said, "and I'm not asking you to risk anything." "I'm not sure I'm asking you anything yet." A pause. "But I think about you more than I've thought about anyone in a long time, and I thought you should know that too, since we're being plain." Emma looked at the darkening road ahead. Thomas was still visible, a small, steadfast shape on his pony. The stars were beginning, faint and certain. "I think about you too," she said, without drama, without embellishment, the way she said things that were simply true. They rode the rest of the way in a comfortable silence that had warmth in it, and when he helped her down from the wagon at her porch, she kept her hand on his arm for a moment after she was steady on her feet, just a moment, the length of a breath, and then she let go. He came back 2 days later, and the day after that, and eventually it stopped being remarkable that he was there and started being remarkable only on the days that he wasn't. He came in the mornings before his own work and in the evenings after, and he never came empty-handed. Sometimes he brought feed grain or a cut of good beef or a newspaper from Harlow Creek, and these things were always presented as things he had simply found convenient to bring along, and never as gifts that asked anything in return, which was a very specific kind of care that Emma recognized and valued. Her ankle healed on schedule, which she was grateful for because there was a great deal of work that needed doing, and she was beginning to find her enforced limitation genuinely frustrating. During those 2 weeks, Samuel's 2 hands, Clay and Marsh, came by to help Pete with the heavier ranch work, on Samuel's arrangement and Emma's salary, which she paid them because she did not accept things for free. It was during those 2 weeks that she and Samuel did most of their real talking. the kind that happens between people who have more time together than usual and whose external business has been temporarily reduced, so the conversation has to find its own subjects. They talked about their childhoods, which in both cases had been Texas childhoods, poor in money but rich in the particular knowledge that comes from a life lived close to the land. He had grown up on the ranch his father had built from almost nothing, and he had taken it over at 23 when his father's health failed, and he had spent the following 15 years making it what it was now. She had grown up in the eastern part of the state, the daughter of a farming family, and she had come west with James Crawford when she was 20, and Texas West had surprised her, the scale of it, the hardness of it, the way it demanded something from you that was not effort exactly but something beneath effort, something more like commitment. "Do you love it?" Samuel asked her once, sitting on the porch after Thomas had gone in, the evening warm and still around them. "The land, I mean, it's not just that you've made a life here." Emma thought about this honestly. "Yes," she said. "It took me a long time to love it. For years I just endured it, and then something shifted. Now I can't imagine anywhere else being real in the same way." "That's exactly it," Samuel said, and there was something in his voice, a relief almost, at being understood about something he had perhaps not articulated to many people, that made her look at him with a new kind of attention. She was falling in love with him. She knew it with the same calm certainty with which she knew when a fence post was well set. You put your weight on it and it held. She was not frightened of the knowledge exactly, but she was cautious with it, the way you were cautious with anything that mattered. She was aware of all the ways it could go wrong. She was aware of what it would mean for Thomas. She was aware that she had not been in love in a long time, and that the person she had been in love with before was a different woman, younger, less formed, without the particular armor she had built with her own hands over the years of alone. She was aware that she would have to choose, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small choices, whether to let the armor do its job or whether to believe that some things were worth the risk of laying it down. It was Thomas who began asking when Mr. Thatcher was coming next, which told her everything she needed to know about where her son stood on the question. One evening in late July, with the heat easing toward something almost bearable and the stars so close and thick they seemed to press on the tops of your ears, Samuel said to Emma, seated on her porch, "I'm going to say the thing plainly if that's all right." "It's all right," Emma said. "I'd like to court you," he said, formally. "With your permission and with everything that means, the intention being marriage, if things go well between us, and I believe they will. I'm not a man who says things like this unless I mean them all the way." Emma looked at her hands in her lap, those calloused, hard-worked, honest hands, and then she looked up at him, and his face in the evening light was steady and open and exactly itself. "Thomas would have to be part of it," she said. "Not secondary, part of it from the beginning." "I know that," Samuel said. "I wouldn't want it any other way. And the ranch is mine, my property, my decisions. I'm not looking for someone to take it over. I have my own ranch," he said, with a small smile that was the first hint of lightness he had allowed himself in this serious conversation. "I'm not in the market for a second one." "Then yes," Emma said. "You may court me, formally." He reached out and took her hand carefully and held it the way you hold something you are afraid of crushing, and she let him, and the evening was immense and quiet around them and the stars went on forever. Courting, in the summer and fall of 1882 in West Texas, was not the same as in the cities or the eastern states. There were no dinner parties or formal calls or chaperones. It was a practical, land-bound thing, shaped by the rhythms of the work and the distances of the country. Samuel rode out to Emma's ranch and Emma sometimes rode out to his, and they worked together on various tasks and ate together and talked. And on Sundays they drove to the small church in Harlow Creek together, Emma, Thomas, and Samuel, in Samuel's wagon, and the town noticed and had its opinions, which both Emma and Samuel were aware of, and neither was particularly governed by. Not everyone was warm about it. There was a certain kind of person in Harlow Creek, as there was in every western town, for whom a widow who had kept her own ranch and made her own decisions for 4 years was a source of low-level social discomfort, and for whom the idea of that widow conducting her own courtship on her own terms without deferring to anyone's advice or permission was additionally uncomfortable. There were remarks made at the dry goods store and in the saloon that were the specific remarks people make when they disapprove of something they can't quite bring themselves to say they disapprove of directly. Emma heard about most of these remarks through the efficient telegraph of small-town knowledge, and she treated them the way she treated most obstacles. She noted them, assessed whether they required any action, and then kept moving. Samuel heard some of them too, and he was less philosophical about it than Emma. He came from old Texas ranching stock and had a deep-rooted sense of personal honor that made insinuation about the people he cared about feel like something requiring a direct response. Emma talked him back from several of these potential responses, with the patient firmness of someone who has dealt with human stupidity for long enough to know when it is and isn't worth engaging. You would ride into a conversation about gossip the way you ride into a bad stretch of fence, she told him once, and you would be just as effective, and you would wear yourself out on it. It bothers me more when it's about you than it does when it's about me, he said. I know, she said, but I have handled far harder things than the opinions of people with nothing better to do. He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and the particular frustration of someone who loves someone's strength, and also desperately wishes they could protect them from the things that make that strength necessary. Autumn came with a change in the quality of the light and air that was nothing like autumn in the eastern states, but was its own thing, a slight softening of the heat, a clarity in the sky that felt like the land exhaling after the long tension of summer, the grass going gold and dry in a way that had beauty in it if you looked for it. On a Friday evening in October, Samuel brought Emma a book he had ordered through the land agent in Harlow Creek, who sometimes carried goods from the East, a new edition of an atlas of the American territories, which was exactly the kind of thing Emma found endlessly interesting, and which Samuel had realized this through a conversation they'd had months before, and had remembered without being asked to remember. Emma held the book and opened it to the territory maps and ran her calloused thumb along the topography lines and said nothing for a moment. And when she looked up at Samuel, her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was in the same family. "This is a good gift," she said. "You are a hard person to buy a gift for," he said, "because you only want things that are genuinely useful to you." "Is that a criticism?" "No," he said. "It's one of my favorite things about you." She put the book down on the porch rail and looked at him, and something in her face had changed. The last trace of the careful, measured distance she had maintained all through the summer and fall had come down, or not come down exactly but become transparent, so you could see through it to what was behind it, and what was behind it was something warm and deep and entirely certain. "Samuel," she said. "Emma," he said back, and there was everything in the way he said her name. She stepped toward him, and he met her in the middle, and when he kissed her it was not impulsive or tentative but full and clear and meant. The kind of kiss that is the physical expression of a decision that has already been made at a deeper level, long before the moment arrives. They stood on the porch in the cool October air and held on to each other, and the land was wide and darkening around them. And inside the house, a lantern burned where Thomas was reading, and everything was exactly as it should be. The conversation that followed was long and serious, and covered the practical geography of their futures with the thoroughness that both of them applied to things that mattered. He proposed, and she accepted, and then they talked for 2 hours about how it would work, the 2 ranches, the land, Thomas, the finances, where they would live and how, who would make what decisions and how those decisions would be made together. She was not going to dissolve into his life. She was going to fold her life into his and his into hers, and the join was going to be strong and visible and deliberate, not hidden. This was not a romance of losing yourself. It was a romance of two complete people choosing, clearly and with open eyes, to be more together than they were apart. Thomas, informed the next morning over breakfast with a directness that Emma felt he deserved, listened to the whole explanation without interrupting, then said, "Will we still live at our ranch?" "For now, yes," Emma said, "and Mr. Thatcher's ranch will be close enough that you can ride between them." Thomas thought about this with the thoroughness he applied to significant decisions. "Will I still go to school in the fall?" "Absolutely," Emma said. Thomas looked at Samuel. "That colt still doesn't have a name." Samuel, who had learned to follow Thomas's logic, said, "That's right. Can I name it?" "I think that's fair," Samuel said. Thomas nodded once with the decisiveness of someone who has weighed all the available evidence and reached a verdict. "All right then," he said, and returned to his breakfast. Emma met Samuel's eyes over Thomas's head, and they shared a look that contained enough warmth to heat the room. The wedding was held in November 1882 at the Harlow Creek church on a clear, cold day with a sky so blue it looked painted. It was not a large event. Emma had not wanted large. She wore a dress that had been her good dress for years, navy blue with cream at the collar and cuffs, and she had pressed it the night before with a hot iron, and it looked fine. She wore her hair up and pinned, and she carried a small bunch of late wildflowers that Thomas had ridden out into the draw to find for her, and she walked herself up the aisle because there was no one she wanted to walk her up it, and she did it the way she did everything, straight-backed and clear-eyed and fully present. Samuel, standing at the front of the church in his good coat with Marsh and Clay behind him as witnesses, watched her come up the aisle, and his face was doing something that made even Marsh, who was not given to emotion, look at his boots for a moment out of respect for the privacy of it. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, which covered love and honor and faith, and the keeping of those things through difficulty and ease both. Emma said hers clearly and without hesitation, and Samuel said his with a steadiness that was better than eloquence. And when the minister pronounced them married, Samuel took her hands, her calloused, proud, capable hands, and held them in his, and the church was quiet and full of light. The town came to the short gathering after at the church hall, including several of the same people who had made remarks over the summer, who now shook hands and smiled with the flexibility of people who had decided that what was done and might as well be celebrated. Emma was gracious to all of them because she was not interested in grudges. She had too much to do. Thomas had been given permission to ride his pony to the church himself, and he arrived slightly late and slightly windswept, and joined the gathering with the easy authority of a boy who had decided this was a good outcome and was prepared to enjoy it. He shook Samuel's hand after the ceremony with great seriousness, and Samuel shook his back with equal seriousness, and that was its own kind of covenant. The first winter of their marriage was the winter of building, not just the literal kind, though there was plenty of that, but the interior kind that happens when two established, independent people begin the intricate work of making room for each other without losing themselves in the process. They had decided to make Emma's ranch the primary home for now. It was smaller and more manageable as a household, and Thomas's schooling was already established around the Harlow Creek side of the county. Samuel rode between the two properties daily, managing both, and he hired an additional hand for the Thatcher spread to compensate for his reduced hours there. This was a financial strain for the first several months, and they discussed it openly and worked out the numbers together at the kitchen table, which was exactly how Emma had always handled the finances of her life, and which Samuel adapted to with less difficulty than she had feared. There were adjustments. There were evenings when the tiredness of two people who had both been working since before dawn and who had different habits and different rhythms produced friction. There were conversations that were harder than either of them had anticipated, conversations about how decisions got made and whose instincts were right when they disagreed. Emma had been making all her own decisions for 4 years, and the instinct to consult was not automatic, and Samuel had been running his own operation for 15 years and had his own deep-grooved ways of doing things. They were both stubborn in the specific way of people who have learned to rely on themselves, and stubbornness in two forms meeting head-on can produce heat. But they were also both honest people, and they had both come into this marriage with clear eyes about what it was and what it would take, and when the friction happened they dealt with it directly instead of letting it fester, which was the thing that saved most of the conversations that could have turned into damage. One evening in February, after a disagreement about whether to take a risk on a new breeding pair that Samuel wanted and Emma thought was not worth the expense at the current time, they sat in the kitchen in the aftermath of raised voices and said nothing for a while, and then Emma said, "I was right about the numbers." "I know," Samuel said, "and you were right that the long-term gain is worth considering." "I know that too," he said. "We're both right about different parts of it." "That is a very annoying feature of this marriage," Emma said. "It is," he agreed, and then they were both laughing, quietly at first and then more fully, and the tension dissolved in the laughter the way ice dissolves in spring. They did not buy the breeding pair that year. They bought it the following spring, when the numbers had improved to the point where Emma agreed the risk was acceptable, and the decision was better for having been delayed, which they both had the grace to acknowledge. Spring of 1883 was good. The water in the draw ran well. Both herds came through the winter with minimal losses, and Thomas, who had started the school year in Harlow Creek and was riding the 12 miles himself now on the pony Samuel had given him, not the sorrel colt but a steady, reliable gray roan that was a better first independent horse, was doing well with his numbers and his reading, and had discovered, through the school's small lending library, a deep love for books about natural history that Emma found entirely comprehensible. Emma had planted a kitchen garden that spring, something she had not done since James's death because it had seemed like too much for one person, and the garden was thriving in a way that gave her a private satisfaction she didn't talk about much but that Samuel noticed and was glad of. She found, as the months of the marriage accumulated, that she had not lost herself in it, had not been absorbed or diminished. She had remained exactly herself, and somehow the fact of being known and valued by this specific person in this specific way made herself feel more fully present, not less. She was still the woman with the calloused hands and the proud eyes who had walked into that bank alone and not flinched. She was also a woman who had someone to come home to, and who was learning what it meant to let yourself be looked after without that looking after meaning you were less. Samuel had his own lessons to learn. He had been alone a long time, in the particular way of busy, self-contained men who fill their lives with work and do not notice the absence of depth until depth arrives and they feel, with a shock, how much they had been missing it. He had not known how much he was carrying alone until there was someone carrying it with him, and the lightening of it moved him in ways he was not always comfortable expressing, and that Emma gave him time to find his way to expressing. He brought her coffee in the morning before she was up, and she let him, which was itself a kind of love. He fixed things on the ranch without being asked when he saw they needed fixing, and she said thank you and meant it, which was itself a kind of trust. He listened to her read to Thomas in the evenings, and she knew he was listening because she could feel the particular quality of someone's attention even when their eyes were on something else. In the summer of 1883, Emma discovered she was carrying their first child. She sat with the knowledge for a day before telling Samuel, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted a day with it for herself first. When she told him, she did it directly over supper, and his face went through something so total and unguarded that she had to look away from it for a moment because the openness of it was almost too much. Thomas told immediately after because Emma refused to keep things from Thomas that concerned their family, took approximately 45 seconds to absorb the information, and then said with great seriousness, "A brother would be good, or a sister. But a brother would be good." Thomas's preferences notwithstanding, In the spring of 1884, Emma gave birth to a boy. They named him James Samuel Thatcher James for Emma's late husband, because he was Thomas's father and that deserved acknowledgement, and Samuel for the man who had stood up from a chair in a bank and been present and honest and steadfast through everything that followed. The birth was hard. Emma's births always seemed to be hard. Thomas's had been too, and Doc Reeves came out from Harlow Creek for it. And Samuel sat outside the bedroom door for the entirety of the labor in a state of controlled distress that Pete Dawson, who brought him coffee at intervals, elected not to comment on. When Doc Reeves opened the door and told him everything was fine and that he had a son, Samuel went into the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside Emma, who was exhausted and pale and holding the baby with the competent, careful arms of a woman who had done this before. And he looked at the small, certain face of his son, and then at Emma's face, and he said nothing for a long time, and Emma did not require him to say anything. The boy was healthy and loud, and had Emma's dark eyes and Samuel's broad hands even as a newborn, which old Pete declared to be a very practical combination of features. Thomas held his brother with the same careful seriousness he brought to everything important, and declared him acceptable, which was the highest form of Thomas's approval. Life took on a new rhythm with the baby, a disrupted, demanding, exhausting, and illuminating rhythm that neither Emma nor Samuel would have said they were fully prepared for, and that both of them found, in the interrupted nights and the endless practical demands of a new life in the house, to be shot through with a kind of joy that was different from any joy they had known before. Emma healed quickly, because that was her nature, and was back at the daily work of the ranch within a time frame that Doc Reeves found excessive, and that Samuel worried about, and that Emma was calm and practical about. She had a baby to feed and a ranch to run and a husband who was doing double work to cover for her and Thomas who still needed to be gotten to school, and all of these things needed doing. What was different from the first time she had recovered from childbirth, alone in this house with a newborn Thomas, and a sense of grief and isolation that she had never spoken aloud to anyone, was that she was not alone. Samuel was there, and his being there was not a burden or an obligation but a presence solid and warm and consistent, that made everything easier in the way that good ground makes walking easier. By the fall of 1884, both ranches were operating under a newly consolidated structure that Samuel and Emma had worked out over many evenings of careful accounting. They had hired a capable foreman for the Thatcher spread, a man named Ben Acaffer who had worked cattle in central Texas for a decade, and who was calm and excellent, and about whom the town's more limited residents had some predictable opinions that Emma and Samuel addressed directly and uniformly, and without patience, making it clear that the opinions were not welcome at their table or on their land. Ben Acaffer proved over the following years to be one of the best decisions they had ever made, and his loyalty to the combined Thatcher-Crawford operation was a thing built of mutual respect and fair dealing, which was how Emma and Samuel believed all working relationships should be built. The mid-1880s were prosperous years for the Texas cattle industry, and the Thatcher spread expanded carefully and well, guided by Emma's meticulous accounting and Samuel's instinctive knowledge of the land and cattle. They were not wealthy in the way that the large cattle barons of central Texas were wealthy, and they did not want to be. That kind of wealth came with the kind of cost, in ruthlessness and land seizure, and the particular abuses of power that the cattle baron era was full of, that neither Emma nor Samuel was willing to pay. They had dealt at the edges of it, the increasing pressure from larger operations looking to absorb smaller ranches, the railroad deals that favored the powerful, the gradual squeeze on the water rights that sustained the small and mid-sized operations. Emma, whose understanding of contracts and legal language was self-taught but thorough, spent a considerable amount of the mid-decade keeping careful watch on the county land registry and the water rights filings, and more than once caught an attempt to file claims on water that ran through or bordered their land, and moved to counterfile before any damage was done. Samuel called her his best legal mind, which she dismissed, and also his most reliable North Star, which she was more willing to accept. Thomas grew with the years, 12, 13, 14, into a young man who was quiet and observant and capable of a great deal more than most adults expected, and who had his mother's pride and his biological father's practical steadiness, and some quality entirely his own that showed up in the way he could look at a problem from three sides simultaneously, and find the solution that none of the three sides saw coming. He adored James with the particular love of an older sibling who had waited for the baby to become interesting, and then discovered that interesting barely covered it, and he taught him to ride before James was properly old enough and built him a small wooden horse in the workshop where he spent his spare hours, and was present and steady and entirely himself. Harlow Creek grew in those years. A new school building went up, and a proper telegraph office, and a hotel that was 3 stories high and caused considerable civic excitement. The railroad came through the county line, not through Harlow Creek itself, but close enough that the cattle drives that had been the primary method of getting beef to market were no longer the only option, and this changed the economics of ranching in ways that some people navigated well and others did not. Emma and Samuel navigated it well, because Emma had been watching the railroad economics carefully for 2 years before the line went in and had already positioned their operation to take advantage of the new access, and because Samuel trusted her reading of these things absolutely, which was not because he was deferential by nature. He was not, but because he had watched her be right about enough things for long enough that trust was simply the logical conclusion. On a December evening in 1886, with James 2.5 and asleep in the back room, and Thomas 16, and doing his mathematics at the kitchen table with the focused intensity of a young man who had recently realized he might want to go further with his education than the county school could take him, and the first light snow of the season coming down outside the window and making the land both quieter and larger, Emma and Samuel sat by the fire after supper. She was mending, she was always mending something, and he was reading the county paper, and the fire was warm and the room smelled of the supper they had eaten and the pine of the walls, and the snow made the window a soft, white-lit thing. He set down the paper and looked at her. She was bent over her work, the lamplight catching the planes of her face, and she was wholly herself in this moment. The same woman who had walked into a bank in 1882 with calloused hands and proud eyes, and refused to be diminished by a man behind a desk. She was also more than that woman now, or not more, but layered the woman who came home, the woman who made this house what it was, the woman who had made a life so deliberately and so fully and with such absolute conviction that it had become a kind of art. "Emma," he said. She looked up. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said things he meant absolutely, without decoration, without preamble, as a fact of the world. She held his gaze, her hand stilled on the mending. The fire shifted. "I know," she said, and then, because she was Emma and because the plain truth was always better than the dressed-up kind, "I love you too. I have for a long time." He smiled, and it was the full smile, the one that changed his whole face, and she returned it with her own, not the polite, controlled smile she wore in the bank or in town, but the real one, the one that reached all the way to those proud eyes and made them warm. Snow fell outside in the December dark, and the fire burned, and Thomas scribbled his numbers, and James slept, and the life they had built together out of stubbornness and honesty and hard work, and the particular courage of choosing someone fully and clearly settled around them like something very solid and very good. The winter of 1887 brought 2 things of significance. The first was a letter from the State University at Austin that arrived in late January, addressed to Thomas Crawford, informing him that his application for enrollment in the following fall's class of students in the Faculty of Natural Sciences had been accepted with a small scholarship attached, based on his entrance examinations, and the letter of recommendation written by the Harlow Creek schoolmaster, who had not done Thomas's abilities justice, but had at least pointed in the right direction. Thomas read the letter twice at the kitchen table, carefully, and then set it down and looked at his mother. Emma read it, and her eyes did the thing they did when something moved her through the defenses. They went very bright and very still, and she was quiet for a moment in a way that said more than sound would have. Then she said, "Well, Austin," Thomas said, "it's a good school." "It's a very good school," Emma said. Samuel, who had come in from the yard in time to hear the end of this, and who had read the letter over Emma's shoulder, said, "It is an excellent school, and you are going to do remarkable things there." And his voice had the directness of someone who believed what they were saying with no reservation. Thomas looked at both of them with his careful, dark eyes, and then did something he had not done very often since he was small. He leaned forward and hugged his mother, hard, and she held him back just as hard, and over his shoulder her eyes met Samuel's, and the look between them was too full to have a simple name. The second thing the winter brought was the news that Emma was expecting again. This time she told Samuel the same evening she knew, sitting on the porch in the cold with their coats on, and the stars very close the way they always were in the clear Texas winter sky. He took her hand and held it, and they sat together in the cold and the quiet and the enormous starlit dark, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. In the summer of 1887, Emma gave birth to their second child together, a girl this time, solid and loud, and with Samuel's gray eyes and Emma's determined chin, and they named her Clara, after Samuel's mother, who had died when he was 12 and who he had loved very much and spoken of only rarely, which made the name a kind of trust. James, who was 3, was brought in to meet his sister with Thomas holding his hand, and he studied Clara for a long time with the serious, assessing gaze he had inherited from his mother, and then declared, with the authority of a 3-year-old, "She is very small." "She will get bigger," Thomas told him gravely. James considered this. "All right," he said, and accepted Clara with the equanimity of a child who had been raised around things that needed patience. Thomas left for Austin in the fall of 1887, riding to Harlow Creek with Samuel beside him and his trunk loaded in the wagon, and from Harlow Creek taking the stage that would connect him to the railroad line and eventually to the university. Emma watched the wagon go from the porch of the ranch house with Clara on her hip and James holding her hand, and she watched it until she could not see it anymore. And then she stood a little longer watching the place where it had been, and the feeling in her chest was pride and grief and love, and the deep satisfaction of having done the thing you most needed to do, which was to raise a person who was capable of leaving. Thomas wrote every 2 weeks, regular as the seasons, long detailed letters full of the things he was learning, and the people he was meeting, and the questions that the studying was raising in his mind. And these letters were read aloud at the kitchen table on the evenings they arrived, and then kept in the cedar box on the mantelpiece where Emma kept things that mattered. The years moved in the way that good years do, not slowly or quickly, but at a pace that feels just right when you are in them, which you only notice in retrospect. Clara grew and became herself loud and brave and opinionated in the way of people who decide early that the world is full of interesting things, and they intend to participate in all of them. James grew into a quiet, observant boy who loved horses with the devotion of someone who has found their native language, and who could communicate with difficult animals through some quality of patience and presence that even Samuel, who was good with horses himself, found striking. The ranch prospered. They expanded the herd when the year was good and held steady when the year was hard, and there were hard years. There were always hard years in Texas cattle country, but they were hard years navigated together, with the double resource of 2 minds that trusted each other and 2 sets of calloused hands that knew what work was. Harlow Creek grew into something that could almost be called a town. The bank changed management twice, and both times Emma watched the new management with a careful eye and found, to her quiet satisfaction, that neither of the new managers had the particular variety of meanness that Horace Bellamy had possessed. Bellamy himself had left the county in 1884 to take a position in Dallas, which the town's general opinion had found to be entirely appropriate. On an afternoon in the spring of 1891, Emma was working in the kitchen garden when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see Samuel riding in from the north boundary, unhurried, with his hat pushed back on his head and his coat open in the warm air, and something about the way he sat his horse, the ease of him, the solidity, the simple and total comfort of a man who was exactly where he belonged, made her stop what she was doing and just watch him. He saw her watching and rode toward her and pulled up at the garden fence, and looked down at her from the horse with an expression she had learned in 9 years of marriage to read with precision, warmth, and humor, and a deep, private gladness that he did not show to the world but showed to her always. "What are you looking at?" he said. "You," she said, without embarrassment. He dismounted and let the horse's reins drop. The horse was reliable enough to ground tie, and came around the fence and stood beside her in the garden, looking at the rows of things growing, and then he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the afternoon sun was warm on both of them. "Thomas is coming home for the summer," she said. "His letter said the end of May." "I know." Samuel had read the letter too. "He wants to spend some time in the draw studying the birds. Apparently he has a whole scientific framework now for why the birds in this part of Texas are different from the birds in the East. He is going to come home and explain this framework to us for 3 months, Emma said, and there was so much love in her voice that even the mild exasperation in the words was a form of it. "I am deeply looking forward to it," Samuel said. Clara's voice came from somewhere behind the barn, where she had been pursuing some project involving James and a length of rope and a very patient mule, a project that Emma had elected not to investigate too closely. James's voice followed, low and careful, the voice he used with animals. Samuel said, 9 years. Emma said, 9 years. A silence, and then he said, "I would do it again exactly." She tilted her head to look up at him. His face was weathered and familiar and dear, and there was silver in his hair now, and the lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened in the way that outdoor years always deepened them, and he looked completely and entirely himself. "I would too," she said. "I would do all of it again." He kissed her there in the garden, in the warm spring afternoon, with the children's voices carrying from behind the barn and the horses at the fence, and the sky enormous and blue above the Texas flatland. And it was the kind of kiss that was also a statement of chosen things and kept promises and the cumulative weight of years well spent together. She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and her hands, those calloused, proud, capable hands, were in his, and she said, "Come and see what I've done with the south garden bed. I put in the tomatoes the way your mother's recipe calls for." And he followed her into the garden, and they looked at the tomatoes together, and the afternoon went on around them in the good, ordinary, extraordinary way of days that are simply lived fully, and the land held them both in its flat, vast, steadfast embrace, the same land that had asked everything of them and given everything back. Thomas came home in late May as promised, taller and fuller in the face, carrying 3 notebooks of field observations and a carefully preserved collection of bird specimens, and an enthusiasm for the Draw Creek ecology that kept supper conversations animated for the better part of 2 months. He was 21 years old and beautiful in the way that young people are beautiful when they have been allowed to become themselves, and Emma watched him and felt the oldest feeling, the pride that was almost like grief, or the grief that was almost like pride, which was the particular feeling of seeing your child fully arrived at themselves, and knowing they are going to take that self out into the world. James spent Thomas's entire visit at his side, learning the names of birds with the patient thoroughness he brought to all learning, and by the end of the summer could identify 14 species of songbird by their call alone, which Thomas declared to be genuinely impressive, and which Samuel confirmed. Clara, at 4, was mostly interested in whether Thomas would teach her to ride his horse, which he did, walking her around the yard on a lead rope with the serious care of someone who understood that this was important to her, and therefore important. When Thomas left at the end of August, James cried quietly in the barn where he thought no one would notice, and Emma, who noticed everything, found him there and sat beside him in the hay for a while without saying anything, because sometimes that was the right thing. The autumn of 1891 was golden and warm, and the cattle market was good, and they sold the fall herd at strong prices through the new rail connection, and the accounts that Emma balanced by lamplight on October evenings were the best they had been. She and Samuel sat with the final numbers one night and looked at them together, and she said, "We are all right." He said, "We are better than all right." She said, "Don't get comfortable," but she was smiling when she said it. He laughed and poured more coffee, and they sat together at the kitchen table in the lamplight with the night pressing soft against the windows, and the house settled around them with the deep quiet of a house that has been fully lived in and fully loved. There was a moment, late in that October evening, when Emma set down her pen and looked up from the accounts ledger, and looked at the kitchen, at the lamp burning steady, at the children's boots by the door, at Samuel reading at the other end of the table, at the cedar box on the mantelpiece with Thomas's letters in it, at the window with the dark and the stars beyond. And she felt something so complete and so present that it had no language, only the feeling itself, which was something like, "This is the life, not this is the life I settled for, or this is the life I fought for in spite of everything, but simply, this is the life, mine, fully and wholly mine, made with my own hands and my own choices, and the love of a man who stood up from a chair in a bank one spring morning in 1882 for no other reason than that it was right, and who had been standing up ever since, in all the ways that mattered." She looked at Samuel, and he felt her looking and looked up, and they regarded each other across the lamplight table with the easy, deep, specific knowledge of two people who know each other through and through, and he said, "What?" And she said, "Nothing, everything." And he smiled, that full smile that had always changed his whole face, and she smiled back, and the lamp burned on, and outside the Texas night was wide and still and full of stars, and inside everything was warm and certain and entirely, irrevocably, beautifully complete.